Hello, my name is Nathan Smith, and I'm the Director of Economics and Policy at Connected Nation, a nonprofit national broadband consultancy. And I'm going to be talking today about BEAD Deconfliction. BEAD is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program that was established by Congress through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in November 2021. And deconfliction is a term of art that has emerged to describe the special challenge of dealing with overlap areas in the context of that program. So, a very important topic for states as they prepare to roll out the funds. The BEAD program has caused some concern because of what's perceived as being the slow rollout. The truth is that a lot of that delay, it's been 3 years since it was passed, hasn't connected anyone to broadband yet, but a lot of that delay was actually built with the timelines that were established in the law. BEAD aims at universal coverage, and to try to achieve that takes quite a bit of planning. It's more complicated than just making incremental progress as many other programs have done. Also, you have to deal with some costs that are really expensive to serve, and vetting applicants is always difficult. Don't be too strict and not get enough participation, but you don't want to be too loose and end up awarding to unqualified companies. But a lot of the delay has related to both the federal agency and states being kind of flummoxed by how do you deal with overlaps among projects. So some general BEAD principles. First of all, fiber preference. BEAD prioritizes end-to-end fiber over other technology. Second, you're supposed to start with the unserved locations and solution on those before you go to underserved locations that already have 25.3. There's a scoring rubric customized per state that is supposed to be used in cases of like-to-like competition between projects. ISPs have to consent to whatever you ultimately do. And above all, you have to fit everything together like a puzzle so that you achieve universal coverage in your state, but you're only awarding one project per area. And so this is really quite difficult, this kind of geometric problem of making everything fit together. Most states, by the way, are pre-grouping broadband serviceable locations into project area units, which in some ways simplifies the problem. We'll look into more about that later. But so what is deconfliction? Let's take the simplest case where you have three project areas that need coverage solutions, areas 1, 2, and 3. You have two projects that offer coverage solutions, projects A and B. And project A wants to serve areas 1 and 2. Project B wants to serve areas 2 and 3. So you can't just award both projects because they have an overlap, area 2. Area 2 has to be awarded to one of the projects. In this case, it should be project A since it's the fiber project under fiber preference. And then area 3 is left to project B, but project B may not be willing to accept that because if they had a plan to serve areas 2 and 3, then the business case for serving area 3 alone may not be sufficient. We'll see more about why later on. But so deconfliction is the challenge of somehow working through situations like this to get to a universal coverage solution with no overlaps. It could also be the rubric score that's driving the preference. So in this case, we've got two fiber projects, but project A has a higher rubric score. And once again, project A gets areas 1 and 2. Hopefully area 3 goes to project B, but they may or may not accept that. So that's the challenge. And the concept of severability will be important throughout this. Severability would be the idea that some portion of a project could be cut off and offered as a separate project to an ISP and that they would be willing to accept that. Sometimes they will, but that can't be taken for granted. So in this example, then I say project B has no severability. It offers universal coverage, areas 1, 2, and 3 in this case, but they have to get all of it. It's all or nothing. And in this case, project A has a higher rubric score. So although you might want to go for universal by awarding project B, most state rules actually would assign this area to project A, and then you wouldn't get a solution for area 3, which is a bit of a problem. Here's another example, which is a little bit ironic because you actually get to a universal coverage solution in this example, but you don't get the highest rubric scoring project for each area. So in this case, project A has the highest rubric score. They would win areas 1 and 2. Project B seems like it ought to beat project C because it has a higher rubric score, but project B wants areas 2 and 3, and area 2 has already been awarded. And you have no severability here, so project B drops out. Project C gets areas 3 and 4. You get all the areas served. You get no overlaps among the projects, but area 3 doesn't get the highest scoring project. And if area 3 residents are a little upset about that, then you might be able to justify it if you have gone to project B and project B just told you, no, we can't do area 3 on its own. Well, what if you never asked project B whether they would or wouldn't? then you might have a little bit of a more awkward situation. So it's good to find out what flexibility you have and use it to get the highest rubric scoring projects that you can. So, all right. So I mentioned that project area predefinition has been widely embraced by states partly as a way to avoid deconfliction, but some states, on the contrary, have embraced deconfliction, and often there's a mix of the two. There's some project area planning, but there's also a recognition that some multi-area projects will be proposed, and then there's a deconfliction procedure in order to reduce the overlaps. And so there's this kind of trade-off between project area planning and deconfliction. And this slide shows some of the advantages of going in the direction of having more flexibility and more deconfliction. So let's suppose you have a road with 3 houses along it, houses 1, 2, and 3. House 1 is quite close to ISP A's coverage footprint. House 3 is quite close to ISP B's coverage footprint. And House 2 is somewhere in the middle, a little awkward for either of them to serve. But the state broadband office has to look for a solution to House 2 as well, because they're aiming for universal coverage. So one way they could do this would be to define all 3 houses as one project area. And in the scenario shown, that kind of works. Both of the ISPs step up and they do offer a project that covers House 2, but they have to build a lot more fiber to serve this whole project area that is actually necessary to achieving the coverage goals. ISP A and ISP B both offer to build fiber along the entire road, and really you only need to build from one direction or the other. And so this is kind of wasteful, although you do get competition, which is good. But you could split it up into 2 project areas, as shown in case 5B. Here you get an efficient build. Houses 1 and 2 are grouped together. ISPA builds fiber to House 2, and House 3 becomes a separate project area. But you don't have much competition here. ISPA knows it's probably going to win, so it's probably not going to put a lot of skin in the game or try to cut costs. So you could also end up with something like case 5C, where you have 2 project areas, but they're not efficiently defined. So in this case, the project area predefinition forces House 2 into a project area with House 3. It takes a lot of fiber to build to it from that direction. And you never really want to do this. It's inefficient, but you often won't see the data on the ground that you need in order to determine what's going to be the most cost-effective way to build. So, and some states aren't even trying. They're using some pre-existing geography like census tracts or something in order to find this. So, last case is an example where ISPs define the areas. In this case, this works out pretty well. ISP A proposes houses 1 and 2. ISP B proposes houses 2 and 3. There's competition for House 2. It's probably going to go to ISP A because it has lower costs. But since ISP A knows that it has to compete with ISP B, then it has more incentive to put some skin in the game, and you probably get a better deal for the taxpayers. And a lot of states see this and have embraced deconfliction and severability and all of these complexities in order to try to find a way to the most efficient and competitive solution for their states. So we've seen already that a lot depends on severability. So I want to look at where that comes from. And to get at this, you need to look at the issue from the ISP side of the problem. So broadband offices don't actually need to do the planning, but they need to know how the ISPs are likely to be doing the planning. And this is sort of a stylized representation of how an ISP might do that. So this ISP is looking at a neighborhood with 3 streets. All of the ovals contain a number which represents the incremental net present value of adding that location to the network. The streets as a whole would comprise a viable project. It has 18,000 positive net present value. So, but they would like to stop at the second location on the street A if they could. They'd make more money if they could lose those last 3 locations. But if the state groups it all together in one project area, they'll be okay with that. If the state groups some other portions of this network together, then some of them will be acceptable and some of them would not. So if the ISP is asked to serve the green area as a project, they would be happy to do that. That looks very lucrative and appealing. But if they are asked to serve the red area, they would not do that because they would lose money on that portion of the project footprint. And for the orange region, although the sum of the incremental net present values looks positive, you can't build the network that way. You got to build it along the streets. And so since you'd have to spend a bunch of money to get to all those locations, and that's not being taken into account, that also probably would be unacceptable. So many projects would not actually be considered by ISPs, and probably state broadband offices are usually not going to know what that is. And so they have to have plans to ask. And so this case 7 is an example where an originally messy scenario ends up resolving nicely into a bunch of good projects through the skilled use of severability feedback. So in this case, there's a green project, a red project, and a purple project, 5 project areas. They all overlap with each other, but none of them are coextensive. It's very complicated. But the broadband office, in this case, adopts a policy where they reach out to each of the applicants and says, hey, do you have a must-have area? So is there some area that you have to get in order to stay in play? And they'll assume that anything that includes that will be acceptable to the applicant. So green indicates that area 2 is their must-have area, purple that area 4 is, red that area 1 is, and so this turns out pretty nicely. Green has the highest rubric score, so the broadband office originally awards a grant to the green project for areas 2 and 3. After that, then purple has the next highest score. They can't get area 3 because that's already been awarded, but they can get areas 4 and 5, and that's acceptable to them. And finally, the red project accepts area 1, and so you've got universal coverage and no overlaps. It all works out nicely by asking about severability. But this manner of asking about severability actually doesn't get all the information. And sometimes that could lead to problems, as case 8 shows. So in this example, again, we have 3 projects. We have 4 project areas this time, and we'll focus a little bit on this green project. It's not the highest scoring project. It is trying to get 3 areas, areas 2, 3, and 4. And after they submit, then they would get an inquiry from the state broadband office, the same as before. Do you have a must-have area? And so they'll do a little analysis. And here's the story I have in mind for green. They really want area 2. And so they determine we'll accept any project that includes area 2. And we don't have enough capital, but we'll go get a loan from the bank to cover it because it's worth it. That looks lucrative. If we don't get area 2, we're not willing to go to the bank and ask for a loan. It's just not lucrative enough to justify that. But we do have some retained earnings as well, and we would use those for a smaller project such as area 3 or area 4, but not both. We don't have enough retained earnings to cover the match without the bank loan. We won't do the bank loan unless we get area 2. So they capture all this information in a matrix like what's shown on the right. It shows areas 2, 3, 4. The first 4 rows include the area 2, so they're acceptable. The last 2 are just area 3 or area 4 separately, so those are acceptable. But that 5th row, areas 3 and 4, is not acceptable. So unfortunately, that's exactly what the broadband office is going to try to award them. They'll start with areas 1 and 2 going to red as the highest scoring project, and then they'll make a plan to award areas 3 and 4 to green, thinking that green will accept. But green is not going to accept that. What they really ought to do is award area 3 to green and area 4 to purple, but it may take them long enough to figure that out, given that their process hasn't really led them to that they'll have really lost some time by the time they start making that offer. So the takeaways here are really, I haven't really provided solutions to this. We've thought a lot about solutions. We do have some, but it would take too long to go into that. I just wanted to highlight the difficulty of deconfliction as a policymaking and administration challenge for the states that are trying to implement the BEAD program. It's good for transparency, good for fairness. If you declare all the rules in advance, that could help improve the incentives for participation, and especially for ISPs to be flexible and ambitious in competing. But it's very hard to design rules that cover all of the scenarios that can arise, especially if you want to do it in a way that leads to technical efficiency and is industry friendly, doesn't ask them for too much information. Unfortunately, there's no established best practices for deconfliction. This is a new challenge everybody's trying to solve. State brand offices are going to have to improvise and learn from each other quite a bit, but they have somewhat limited scope to do that because they've already declared some of their policies in the initial proposals that have been approved. So it's a bit of a challenge. But for ISPs, the main takeaway is to just be flexible, be ready to do some contingency planning. And we've thought a lot about this. We'd be happy to share more of our knowledge. Get in touch if you want to. Thank you very much.